Good morning, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. This is another special episode. This is episode 65. And again, I'm not accompanied by a guest today, but this is a continuation of brainstorming my new book that I'm going to publish within the next 2 years, hopefully. That's the goal anyway, to publish this book within the next 2.5 years. It's a long process, but this is going to be talking about in reference to a novel that I wrote in my second chapter of my dissertation entitled Adire y el tiempo roto, Adire and the Broken Time in English. Um, I don't even know if you can get a copy of the book in English, honestly. It's a pretty rare book to obtain. I think there's only one copy left on Amazon. And I think it's around $80 or something by the time you pay tax and everything together. And it's not in the best condition. But we're going to talk some about this novel, Adire y el tiempo roto. The author's name was Manuel Granados, Black man. We have some stuff to talk about as far as his biographical information is really important to this our discussion, informational outlet, I'll call it today, because again, this is really more me talking out loud to myself and you all getting kind of a glimpse into the writing process and also the thought process that goes into these ideas. But it's going to be more of a historical framework too, because there's a lot of misconceptions about the Cuban Revolution, and from the outside, it may seem like it started in 1959, but it's a lot more complex than that, and we're going to get into that in a second. I want to say thanks to my listeners and my viewers, and I encourage everyone to subscribe to Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum for free on YouTube, preferably YouTube first before you decide to do it on the audio podcasting platforms, because that's where the most traction has occurred, is through the videos. People like to see the videos. There's a wider age demographic that likes to watch the videos. Although people do like to commute back and forth to work and listen to the audio versions, which is fine. I'm not going to tell you which version to listen to, but at the very least, subscribe for free on YouTube. That'll help my traction a lot more. It'll help the algorithm as well. It'll help small independent channels. We need to start promoting those independent channels. And because you're not going to find this information in such a concise, packed way in other forums. I'm not saying that to my own horn. I guess I am in a way, but this is a unique podcast, I think, a unique forum outlet for people to get information that they normally wouldn't get. They're getting information from academia, but this is my way of sort of giving back to the people who may not necessarily get this information within the glass ceiling that we call academia. So please subscribe. It doesn't cost you a dime to do that. And tell anybody that's interested, friends, family, anybody that you think may be interested in this type of content, and people who may not be interested in the content. I mean, if you don't like the content, if it tests your views too much and it's too much for you, then unsubscribe. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I think it's worth giving it a listen. This information, I spent a lot of time into this, and and people are listening and watching. I appreciate everything. Again, over almost 20,000 views just on the YouTube channel. So there is traction. People are following the content, and I appreciate every single second of your day that you use to bring attention to this forum, telling your friends and family about it. So the chapter of my dissertation was entitled Defining Black Masculinity's Intersectional Analyses of Gender, Race, and Sexuality in Caribbean and Latin American Literature, 1955 to present. That's the overall title of my dissertation. And I will probably provide it in the episode description link. Although just reading it some now is crazy. It's been almost a year. It's been over a year and a half since I wrote this thing officially and it was published, but just seeing some of the errors, the grammatical errors and stuff, it's just a lot of that's just a product of the writing process, not having the time to look back and revise and proofread and everything else. And even when you get people to look and proofread, you still miss things, and you wish the sentence was worded this way or that way. But I can't feel ashamed of it now. It's already published. It's in the open for everyone to see. So I'm going to link that in the episode description. And this chapter 2 of the dissertation is entitled Multifaceted Black Male Representations in Revolutionary Cuba and the Divergence of Racial and Sexual Conventions in Adida y el Tiempo Roto, the novel that I just mentioned earlier before we started. So we have a lot to talk about here, probably within an hour, because I do have time constraints again today. And I'm also doing that on purpose because I don't want super long videos when it comes to just me being on here, because you all have gotten accustomed to hearing, more than just myself on here at different episodes. But this novel is the most complex novel or work that I've dealt with within my dissertation process when I was writing it. Racially speaking, there's a lot of complexity. Sexuality speaking, there's a lot of complexity. The whole backdrop of what people think of as far as the Cuban Revolution is also ambiguous. This is a subversive novel. It's a novel. The next piece that I end up talking about on another episode is actually a theater piece. So there are a few differences in the genre types, but I like to deal with narrative form. I like to deal with novels. And this novel was written in 1967. Again, Adida y el Tiempo Roto, Adira and the Broken Time. Manuel Granados, born in 1930, died in 1998 in France. He's Afro-Cuban writer. He wrote a lot of other works, but this one was, I think, his most significant contribution. And it's a dark novel. It's dark in the sense that it's not talked about even within Cuba. We will get into those reasons in a second about the history and everything else. So let's start with the historical framework, and then we may get into the novel some the last 25 minutes or so before we end the conversation. Let's talk about the Cuban Revolution, because that kind of, I won't say it opens the novel. The novel itself is achronological. It is broken. There's no order. There's no linear order to the novel. So just to get that out of the way, but all these different things are thrown within the novel. So the Cuban Revolution, 1959 is when it officially was recognized. But the revolution didn't start in 1959. The revolution was a building process. And the novel refers to a particular instance known as the July 26th movement. Now, the Moncada Barracks, which was basically an army post, more or less located in Santiago de Cuba. This was an attempt by Fidel Castro, who ended up being the president of Cuba in 1959, like after they successfully installed the revolution. So Fidel was there with a bunch of different militiamen, revolutionaries, and they had been trying to overthrow the Batista regime. Fulgencio Batista, the person who was in charge before Fidel took over. They were trying to take over back in '53. The unsuccessful attempt of this movement still became recognized as El Día de la Revolución, the day of the revolution, because most people view this as a significant event, even though it was unsuccessful, because it solidified the power of this building coalition of militiamen and different revolutionary components within the country trying to overthrow the Batista regime. Um, so they called it the July 26 movement because this happened July 26, 1953, this attempt to take over the Moncada barracks. So as a result of this failure, Fidel was punished. His brother was also in this group, Raul. And so they were sent to Mexico, basically. They had to go to Mexico. They were supposed to serve a 15-year sentence, I think Fidel was, but he got the courts some kind of way to give them amnesty. And so I think after that in 55, they leave Mexico, they come back to Cuba on a yacht called Grandma, which is a play on words of grandmother in English, the term of your grandmother. So Grandma, spelled Granma, they arrived back on a yacht to Cuba to go back into the country and basically continue with what they started to try to do, which was to overthrow the Batista regime. And so they bring more revolutionaries from Mexico, like while they're in prison over there, and they all go back. And again, a lot of these people are working class. These are poor people, and that's this sentiment has been building in the country. So let's rewind a little bit more. Fulgencio Batista had already been president from 1940 to 1944 in Cuba. Fulgencio Batista was very much in the pocket of the United States, anti-communist, openly anti-communist. If you all don't remember, during this period of time in Cuba, the relationships between the U.S. and Cuba were pretty solid because the U.S., again, we talked about the anti-communist sentiment, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, the Joseph McCarthy era in the United States, the COINTELPRO program from the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, all these different counterintelligence programs to basically clamp down on these communists and all these dissidents. All this stuff is going on during this period of time. That's more so the 50s, like the crux of that really ratcheted in the 50s. But 1940 itself, he was in office, Fulgencio Batista, for 4 years. And he had also been like a senator in Cuba. He had served lots of capacities. He had a lot of power in the country, even when he left after 1944. So he leaves. I think he goes to the United States for like years, 7, 8 years. He goes to the U.S. There's a bunch of turmoil in Cuba, lots of changes of power within presidencies. Like some of these presidents were only presidents for 100 days. So between 1944 and 1952, there were just so many changes of power in Cuba. You had 1952 was significant because Batista decided that he wanted to take control back of Cuba. So he installed a coup in 1952. I think someone else was democratically going to be elected into the government. And so anticipating that the person that he wanted in wasn't going to win, or himself, I believe he was also a part of this process. So he basically installed a military dictatorship in the country in 1952. And so a lot of this is not talked about when we talk about the revolution. The coup of 52, you had a regime that was in before the Castro regime. A lot of the attention is on the Castro regime, and rightfully so, because the Cuban Revolution became this groundswell moment in the history of the Americas and the world. But there's also a lead up to this, and the 1952 coup shouldn't be overlooked either, because if one regime would have stayed in control, it would have stayed in control. And so in 52, Batista got back in to power, like he forcefully got back into power with the military dictatorship. And so in response, you have Fidel Castro and you have all these other revolutionaries that are trying to um, take back the country, so to speak. This is all going on, this back and forth. And I already talked about the July 26th movement. So, um, where can we go from here? So, we fast forward. We know that the revolution was successful. We know that Fidel and his crew and everyone else that was involved, they successfully overthrew the Batista forces. And in 1959, he became the president of Cuba. And the novel talks about this, but in a very cryptic way. It's quite cryptic. And the problem with the novel, well, not the problem, but the issue with the novel is that it's such a labyrinth, cryptic novel. It starts out with the protagonist, Julian, he's dying while this is going on. He's basically bleeding out and dying right when you start to read the novel. And I had to read this 2 or 3 times before I realized that he was actually dying at the beginning, the quote unquote, the beginning of the novel. And that's what I mean. We have to keep in mind when this was written in 1967, this novel for the time was a very experimental novel. You had comparable experimentations during this period. They call it the boom in Latin America, where writers were starting to interact with different types of narrative styles. You have people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian writer, who's associated with this boom movement. You have Julio Cortázar, who was an Argentinian writer, who is associated with this movement. He wrote a novel called Rayuela, Hopscotch in 1963, I believe. And I've read Hopscotch before. It's one of the hardest novels I've ever read, and there's no order to it at all. There's no order to the book. Like chapter 58 may be here, chapter 3 may be in another. So it's all done like this on purpose because it's part of this experimentation. This was an overlooked novel. And again, we'll get into those reasons. But it had such a strong experimentation process with it to the point where people like Julio Cortázar, who are more recognized, who are canonical writers, because every writing base has its favorites, so to speak, the Western canon. When we think of the Western canon, we think of Shakespeare, we think of James Joyce, we think of Virginia Woolf, we think of all these influential writers. The Latin American writers are usually put towards the bottom when we talk about this, but even within Latin America, there's a hierarchy when it comes to certain writers. Their books get more promoted in publishing houses. You can buy their books at Barnes and Nobles. You can buy their books online more easily. This book here is next to impossible to buy because it's not necessarily because it's written by a Black person, but a lot of the Black literature, especially during this time period, was put on the fringes. It was on the margins. And so the stuff that I work with is non-canonical. So it's already coming in where a lot of academics don't even know about this novel. Even in my program, they've never heard of this novel until, I'm not going to say I introduced it to the program because Dawn Duke is the one who influenced me because I was her understudy. But I was actually introduced to this novel by a gentleman named Tomás Fernández Robaina. Tomasito is what he's known as affectionately. A Cuban man, a scholar. I believe he has been involved in the government for years, or he was. Maybe he's at a lesser capacity now, but a very influential writer. I actually sat down with him when I was at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and he told me to look into this novel because I was asking, I want to find a novel that has a Black character that's a complex Black character, not these simplified caricatures. that we're used to seeing in some of these more stereotyped writings, sometimes even by Black writers themselves, but in a lot of cases during the abolitionist literature movement, a lot of what we call Black protagonists and Black characters were actually authored by white people. And so the Blacks themselves really didn't have any agency. They were being written into the literature by whites. But I'm dealing with only Black authors that are writing these stories about themselves, for themselves, to give maximum representation of the story, the psychological angst that they have, whatever it may be. Um, this is like I said, a very interesting novel. I think it would give some service to it to explain some of the history within this period too. We're talking about 1967 is when Manuel Granados published Adire y el Tiempo Roto. Let's go what's happening during this period before I even get into my premise about what I think this is about, what I argue in the chapter. So during the 60s, the revolution was in one of its earliest stages, obviously. In 59, the revolution was officially recognized. And so during the 60s, this was a new period. So one of the first things that the Fidel regime did was install this literacy program because there was a very illiterate population. And even today, Cuba has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. And a lot of that can be given, the credit can be given to Fidel Castro. A lot of these things came at a cost, though. There were some positive things as far as social programs and housing for everybody and healthcare for everybody. But there's also issues with indoctrination. Let's not be fooled. This was authoritarian. You have one authoritarian regime replacing another authoritarian regime, from my standpoint, anyway. And I know some of my friends are very strong communists that follow the forum, and some people don't want to have anything to do with communism, and some people are skeptical of any of these political ideologies. And so that's why I want this forum to be about. I want people to come from all different philosophies and different thought processes. You don't have to agree with anything you hear. It's really just for information. But during this period in the 60s, there was a huge repression and suppression of alternative identities. And what do I mean by that? If you were not willing to bow down or basically buy into this idea of the Cuban Revolution, you were basically an outcast. This is pretty straight up in the 60s. Like, this is a pretty in your face thing. Like, you're either in the revolution or you're out of it. And that's basically how the line was drawn, like todo dentro y fuera nada. So everything inside, outside, nothing. Like, that was an official slogan, basically. Like, you either commit to the revolutionary concept, or you basically, we don't fuck with you, like that. A lot of people were put into internment camps and re-education camps, and basically like modern day concentration camps. They called them re-education camps in Cuba. A lot of these people were disabled. A lot of these people had mental disabilities. Some of these people, or a lot of these people, were gay. A lot of these people were gay men. There was a big condemnation of homosexuality during this period of time in the 60s. They were officially called UMAPs in Spanish, Las Unidades Militares de Producción, the military, I guess, the military units to aid production is what they were recognized as in English, Las UMAP. And Tomas Fernandez, the person I just mentioned earlier that I talked with at UT Knoxville, is part of the revolution now. But even Tomasito admitted that these camps just did. He basically he had a shameful look on his face when I asked him the question about Las UMAP, and he said just do a Google search and you'll see what it is. And he used the word gulag. I did not use gulag. He said that himself, and he was someone that was supposed to be a representative of the revolution. But Tomas is also gay as well, and so he knows how things were back then in the '60s. He knows that things weren't um, as easy as a transition as some of the people who were strong the revolution led it on to be. Um, so there was this witch hunt basically towards gay men, especially. They put them in these camps to basically re-educate them, indoctrinate them, incorporate them back into society. And you take that however way you want to, but you see what I mean about the authoritarian nature of this. This was very prevalent in the '60s. Um, and not only that, this novel was published in 1967, which was a fortunate situation. This is an unbelievable novel. It would have been a disservice for this novel not to have been published and recognized. But even so, being published, it's very much obscure in Cuba. Like I say, even in Cuba, people don't talk about this novel a lot. And a lot of it's for political reasons. Zuleika Romay Guerra is a scholar, and I got to talk to her at UT Knoxville, and she said the reason why is because of the topics that were brought up in Adida. Adida brought up uncomfortable conversations for people that were Cubans during this time that questioned the efficiency of the revolution, race relations, the strained race relations. How do you address people who are gay? Um, how do you recognize the human component of these people within the idea of a revolution? Do we just get rid of our race? Do we get rid of our sexuality because of the cause of the revolution? So you had all these different types of questions coming up. And you have the issue with conformity and nonconformity. This is a very subversive novel. So you had a campaign against writers, especially. There was a situation with a writer called Alberto Padilla. Alberto Padilla was pretty much he became a Cuban dissident. Now, a lot of these people who at one point were for the revolution turned on the revolution for their own reasons. Alberto Padilla in 1968 got caught up with the Cuban government. There was a publication, I think the book was called Fuera del Fuego, Out of Bounds, basically. Fuera del Fuego in 1968 was like a collection of poems, I think. And it really went hardcore against some of the tenets of the revolution, critical of like the strategy of the revolution. It talked about what makes a bad revolutionary, what makes a good revolutionary. And so any of this kind of talk at the time was like, if you even question the revolution, like that's out of bounds. And so he went that way, 1968. And as a result, the Union of Writers in Cuba, La UNIAC, La Unión Nacional de Escritores y Artistas de Cuba, basically like the union, the National Union of Cuban Writers and Artists, didn't like this stance because they were like the official representation of the literary wing of the government. But interestingly enough, they awarded him one of the highest awards you could give him. They gave him the Premio Julian Casal Award. And this was recognized. Like they let him publish the book anyway. Final de Fuego, I think is what it was called. So they recognized the value of his book, but they also condemned him as a result. And because of this problem with Padilla and not Granados, Granados is the writer of this book. Padilla was basically blackballed after that. He went to jail, I think, afterwards, like a couple of years later after the Padilla um, thing happened. He also praised another exiled writer, Gabriel Infante, or Guillermo Infante, I believe is his name, Guillermo Infante, Gabriel Cabrera Infante. He wrote a novel called Tres Tigres Tristes, Three Sad Tigers. Tres Tigres Tristes, Three Sad Tigers, 1965, I believe. And he left. He was once on board with Fidel. He left the country. And Padilla praised him, and then he condemned this other guy, Otero. And that caused a big polemic in the country. So how does this have to do with Manuel Granados and Adida? Well, this was published right before the censorship efforts kicked upticked. So 1967, and Don Duke, my director, basically said that this fell through the cracks. Like people, there was so much attention on other things that this work had already been published a year before, and so I don't think they paid much attention to it. The government did, and it didn't get circulated as much as some of the other works anyway. And so that gave me even more of a reason to work with this novel because I deal with non-canonical text anyway. So there's a lot going on with this. We talked about the UMAP. We talked about the Padilla affair. And I kind of explained the Fulgencio Batista situation. And so you have also in the 60s, the Bay of Pigs, which happened in 61, which was an attempt to overthrow Castro once he was in power by former exiles. So they landed in the Bay of Pigs, La Bahía de Cochinos, Playa Giron Beach, and it was unsuccessful. It was like they squashed it in like 2 or 3 days. Like the Castro people did. I mean, it was considered one of the biggest failures in U.S. history when it came to like an intervention into Latin America, because this was a U.S. led thing, like the Bay of Pigs. It was a CIA operation basically. They were funding everybody to basically go to overthrow Castro, and so that happened, and that's talked about all in Adida. Obviously not Padilla, but his work itself will be under condemnation later. And I say that because Manuel Granados in 91, we fast forward, Cuba and the Soviet Union are close allies at this point, but you also have the fall of the Soviet Union in 91. This opens up a whole nother can of worms. The collapse of the Soviet Union affected Cuba probably more than any other country in the world because of the relationship, the dependency, honestly, that Cuba had with the Soviet Union as far as the infrastructure was concerned, and just like all the different moving parts, there was such a partnership between the two. So 91, a lot of people left Cuba. Not really because of just poverty necessarily. There've been exoduses in Cuba throughout the recent history, and there was a large exodus in 1965, the Camarioca exodus, and then you had the Mariel boat lift in 1980, and then you had the Balseros in 94, I believe, which was basically like the rafting, like this whole movement, people going on the rafts, going over to migrate into Miami, into Florida, the U.S. mainland. And then that created a bunch of policies. Bill Clinton created the wet foot, dry foot policy because of that, I believe in 94. And that was a period where the United States took in a lot of Cuban migrants because of this policy, which isn't any longer a policy. I don't think. I think Obama nulled that policy. but nullified the policy. So anyway, I'm skipping all over the place, but I'm just trying to give you guys a mental picture of what's going on. 91, you have Manuel Granados. He decides to sign a letter called La Carta de los 10. So 10 intellectuals signed on to a document that openly criticized the Castro regime. This was a big no-no. So after that signature, he was basically kicked out of the country. He never went back to Cuba, to my recollection, after that. And he ended up dying in France in 98. That's the reason why he died in France, because he had already left the country in 91. And I actually got a hold of his son. A colleague of mine introduced me to Manuel Granado's son through a DM. And we had, let's just put it this way, we had a short-lived friendship, or or whatever you want to call it, because I think he was curious about me, what I was writing about as far as his dad was concerned, and some of the content of my dissertation. And his views were very, very, very problematic, in my opinion. Not because he was anti-communist, anything like that, but simply because he wrote a bunch of homophobic, transphobic stuff when we were friends on Facebook. And I was like, is this the person I'm talking to? Like, right here, he's this guy's son. Because the interesting part is that in the novel, I make the argument that Julian, the protagonist now in Adida, is a queer character. He's an Afro queer character. Like, that's the argument I make. And it's probably my biggest contribution to this novel into the field. Because as far as I know, I'm the only one that's overtly saying that Julian is a queer character. Because his friends, Granado's friends, acknowledged that he used to have relations with men, like other men, like his closest circles knew that he was basically, like, they said that he was gay, like according to um everything that I've researched. Like, I have all this stuff documented. Um Lourdes Martinez de Chazabal, Comrade James, all these people signed on and said that it was pretty much known in Manuel Granado's private life that he messed around with men and women. I mean, it was clear. Um, and that, I'm not saying that I jumped to that conclusion based on the novel. So how did I get to my conclusion? Based on the novel that Julian, the protagonist, which to me is similar to what happened with Hilarion and Mi Compadre General Sol with Jacques Stephane Alexis's novel. I believe that this is also a self-reflexive novel, albeit very complicated, complex, hard to understand at times because it's such a cryptic writing style. You have complete passages where it's stream of consciousness. And so you have to interpret a bunch of different things, lucid dream states, very complex novel, 350 pages long. It took me 4 or 5 times to actually get the grasp of this novel. But Julian, I argue, was a queer character in this novel. I basically equated it with the top and the down. And if people aren't familiar with these terms, within gay men relationships, the top being viewed as a more expressive, dominant person within the relationship. And again, I'm arguing this within the novel, and the bottom being the person that's more receptive, more submissive. And this is a simplistic way of explaining it to an audience that may not be familiar with this. But that's the way I viewed this. Julian was basically the equivalent of what we call a down low male in the United States. You have these men that portray themselves as straight, but then they go to the nightclubs, they hook up with the other men, they have sex with them, but they live their lives publicly as heterosexual men. But in their private lives, they do completely different things. To me, you have this with Julian in the novel. I compared it to another novel called El Beso de la Mujer Araña, The Kiss of the Spider Woman, which was an Argentinian novel by a writer named Manuel Puig. And you had two protagonists in that novel, Valentin being this, he comes across as this super macho man they meet in jail, and they end up hooking up, having sex, and they befriend each other. They're very skeptical of each other at first, and then you have Melina, who is openly like gay, and then you have Valentin, who some people said would argue that Valentin is not really. He's more. They call it prison gay. Is what that's a terminology that's up to. I didn't go that far because I'm unsure about Valentin and Melina's relationship. But to me, I can't say that Valentin was a queer character. I didn't make that argument in this because that wasn't part of my interest. I think Julian is clearly a queer character in this, and I based that on several scenes, but there's one particular scene where um, Miguel Jose, he's a dying friend of Julian. He's a very close friend of his partner. I argue that they're partners, like that's his partner too, not just his friend. But Miguel Jose is described as white, he's frail. Julian is also broken, but Julian has this militaristic vibe about him because he was in the guerrilla units. That's the thing about it. This is fiction. He's apparently part of the group with Fidel and his revolutionaries, like Julian is. So he's one of these people. That's the crazy thing about this. We're talking about a queer character within this very militaristic, revolutionary ambience. And so that's what I mean by the divergence of racial and sexual conventions. Julian is very complicated. He trashes black women. He calls them names. He says that they smell. He says that his own mom smells. Apesta, apesta a negra. She stinks like a black. But he's black himself. Like the self-hate that Frantz Fanon talks about, how the colonized take on the attitudes of the colonizer, the inferiority complexes that Frantz Fanon talks about a lot, are very prevalent in Adide y El Tiempo Roto. I'm just making sure that I don't lose track of time because I'm expecting someone to be here soon. But so you have all these racial divergencies and sexual convergences. Um, Miguel Jose, upper class, very well read, but he also has this physical disability that the book talks about some. And so Julian almost becomes like a caregiver to him in a way. Like that's like he's there for Miguel Jose as much as he can be. But Miguel Jose inspires Julian. He teaches him literature. He shares like literature with them, and so he's introducing him to a completely different world. And Julian is also introducing Miguel Jose to a completely different world. But the difference is that Miguel Jose is not receptive at all to what Julian is about. Like he doesn't care about his blackness. He doesn't worry about his concerns about being black and impoverished because Julian, even though he has these crazy identity complexes and inferiority complexes, he openly declares like his frustration with the revolution and how it doesn't address racial inequities and with the socioeconomic problems going on too, and how Black people are still marginalized within this marginalization of the marginalized in Cuba. And so that's very intersectional in itself. You guys kind of understand what I meant by intersectionality based on what I was talking about in the first chapter. So you have all this going on, and so there is a questioning of injustice, even though he has these crazy colonized views about whiteness is the perfection and blackness is depravity. I mean, he says this stuff himself in the novel, Julian does. And they have this relationship, Miguel Jose and Julian. Even though Julian is married, he marries a prostitute named Sida, white woman. He's with a woman named Eleonora, white woman, Elsa, white woman. Just you have interracial components with it, but this is something that is very much outside the norm in this time because we're talking about the revolution now. Everyone is like, there's no racial issues. I mean, Fidel said himself in a speech, I believe in 1961, he said, there's not even a shadow of racism and discrimination. That's what he said in the speech. No hay ni una sombra de discriminación racial. He says that. Fidel does. So that's kind of the attitude of the revolution in the 60s. Now, that's all we have to based on the novel. The revolution goes through a lot of changes. The revolution of the 60s isn't the same as the revolution of the 80s, of the revolution of the 90s. Everything progresses over time. Nothing stays the same. So it's very important to understand that the revolution went through different stages. Authoritarian, for sure, but it had to make adjustments because there was a lot of outside pressure for because this was a bad look to people outside of Cuba. The UMAPs, the censorship against authors and the artists that happened in 1968 and afterwards, like the clampdown on what people could write about and express. Fidel said basically, I believe in 68, Fidel Castro said that as long as the revolutionary sentiment was debased, you could basically, he would tolerate whatever. But a lot of that is contradictory, in my opinion, if you read like certain writers, especially writers like Ronaldo Arenas, Antes que Anochezca, Before the Night Falls, a beautiful testimony novel. He was part of these writers that was put in these camps, these re-education camps. He was openly gay, and his views did not align with the Castro regime. So, and Ronaldo Arenas was actually a personal friend of Tomasito. So you have that going on. Even people within the revolution now, a lot of these people are LGBTQ people. There are people on the island that I know and people that we associate with, and there are people in Miami, the same thing. People that are outside the island. There's people all across the spectrum who are queer, revolutionary, queer, and completely anti-revolutionary. So it's not just one size fits all type situation with what's going on in Cuba. So don't listen to what people tell you. You have to really talk to different types of people. But it goes into the whole sentiment that now, I guess, you either in it or you're out it. And wasn't necessarily, I guess it became eventually, it wasn't necessarily because you were gay that you were ostracized. But if you had the revolutionary sentiment, okay, you're good then. But you still had the issue of having to hide who you were. You still had that. And Julian definitely hides who he is in this. And that's why he uses the militaristic smokescreen to discuss I think in a latent way, his queerness. So let's get to the queerness, and then I'm going to leave because I don't think we're going to have enough time. So this is the my contribution. I analyzed the scene where, and before this scene happens, he's escaping like this. They're fighting. The militiamen are fighting. I believe Miguel Jose is sick. We've talked about that before. And Julian is like his best friend. He's there for him. Despite all these racial tensions that they have between each other, overtly racial tensions, the sexual tensions, you have to decipher them because, again, you have to remember that Manuel Granados is having to write about these things within his own consciousness. His own world outside of the novel is complicated because he's living a life where he's having to navigate blackness, queerness, even though he may not have even described it this way himself publicly. But he's having to deal with this himself. And so you have a character that's dealing with these complexities as well. He's fighting with the military, with the revolutionaries in this case, with Fidel and his people. And there's just a bunch of shooting going on. And so he goes into Miguel Jose's house. So you have the masculine, super hyper masculine stuff going on outside with all the military stuff, the posturing, the gunshots, the bombings, everything else. And then he goes into this calm house. And see the dichotomy there? Masculinization, feminization. Miguel Jose, in a way, brings Julian down. He comforts Julian. He makes him relaxed. And I'm not going to say feminizes. That's ridiculous. It's more so. It's a relationship. It's a relationship. They're together. That's what I argue. So there's a scene where I think it's like midnight, and Miguel Jose asked him, I forget who asked who, ¿Quieres tomar café? And if you analyze that one question, ¿Quieres tomar café? Do you want to drink coffee? The first question you have to ask yourself is, and maybe people are, but I'm just saying this is a euphemism in Latin America. ¿Quieres tomar café? Is a euphemism for fellatio, oral sex. It is. It is colloquial, but in certain countries in Latin America, ¿Quieres tomar café? Means it's oral sex. It's a request. That was the first significant thing that I came up with as far as when I saw this message in the book. And I said to myself, who's doing that at 12 o'clock in the morning? You know what I mean? Like it's midnight and you're drinking coffee. So I didn't take it as a literal drinking coffee. I saw it as a request. Miguel wanted to have sex with Julian. And so Miguel is very openly like, hey, I'm down for it. Like, I want to have sex with you. And Julian accepts. And it says that the book says that Julian accepts it. They don't even describe anything. They don't describe anything as far as the degree of their sex. There is another part of the book where it talks about before Miguel Jose dies. We'll get to that in a second. But this part here, it just says that Julian accepts whatever, and they do their thing. They have sex, presumably. That was the first instance where I believe you could just say for sure, based on the text, that Julian was gay or queer. I don't even use gay in the book, actually. I say queer because it could be that he's bisexual. But regardless, he has a queerness component. And I use queerness because queerness, in its more overarching general sense, means nonconformity. So if I say queer, it's a broader definition. It's not simply saying gay or bisexual or whatever. Queerness, because there's too much ambiguity to be for sure if he's gay, straight, whatever, bisexual. So I said queer because I think it's too complex to define as one thing or the other, because these categories are very much, they're constructed and they can be static. And this right here is a moving part situation. It's fluid, because at the same time he's having sex with Miguel Jose, he's also having sex with all these other women. And it's not necessarily because he's enjoying the sex either. But one thing that the novel does, again, another one of those layers that's put on it, is that the author describes openly, almost like to the max, the sex that he has with the women is described just in the most intense terms. Um, Very graphic descriptions of the sex. With Miguel Jose is the complete opposite. Everything is done behind closed doors. And also, leading up to this first sex scene that I interpret as a sex scene, he's actually questioned by a military officer, Julian. I saw that as a sign of authorities questioning him, because for him to get questioned, the authority must see something that doesn't sit well with him. And so I see that as another way of the book suggesting that Julian might be a queer character without going into detail with it. You just have all these different bits and pieces that you have to retrieve and you have to come to your own conclusion. But there's a book by Ian Lumsden. It's called Machos, Maricones, and Gays, a Canadian author, and talks about this dynamic of gay men having to hide themselves publicly in the 60s, especially in Cuba. Remember, this is before Stonewall. Stonewall didn't happen to 69. You didn't have an international LGBTQ movement until late 1969. 1969. This is all pre-Stonewall. And there's other stories that are similar to this with Julian's situation, but it's not as complex. There was a short story called Jum, Jum, by Wico. He's known as Wico. The author is Puerto Rican playwright, and I believe Luis Sanchez is his name. And it talks about homosexuality and blackness, the intersection between those two. But it's a short story. It's like 8 pages long, and it's comparable to some of the sentiment, but this is a very um, dream-induced stream of conscious meets non-traditional narrative style writing versus Whom by Luis Sanchez, which was very much a straightforward, like the character is gay and the whole community is basically just condemning this black gay man. This is not like that at all. There's so much complexity to Julian. Like he has a violent side. He has a more compassionate side. He has a racist side towards himself. And then he has a side that's very understanding of the racial complexities, a la Aimé Césaire, in his philosophy, and Frantz Fanon. So he's very much a conflicted character. So what's the other scene? There's another scene before Miguel Jose dies. He commits suicide. I believe he poisons himself. And before he poisons himself, he goes into describing the size, I believe, of Julian's penis. Like there's a big exposition, but it's all like Miguel Jose doing the descriptive parts of like the explicit, sexual, outwardly sexual. Is Miguel Jose. Julian is always given the cover by the author or by the narrativity. When Miguel Jose is basically outed, like he's clearly the gay character, like he's a gay white man, but Julian is this ambiguous gay black protagonist or queer black protagonist. So it's really hard to decipher. It was a fascinating read, and there's a lot more to it than the sexuality component. You have what else do you have? The interracial relations element you had. All these things were subversive for the time. In Cuba, this is during the meat of the revolution, 67. But as we had in Mi Compadre General Sol, he's describing stuff that's not necessarily in the same year. It's the broken time, Adire y el tiempo roto, Adire in the broken time. So some of this stuff is happening possibly in the 50s. Then it may skip up into the 60s. We don't know exactly when this stuff is happening. And to conclude, Julian has a son. Before he dies, we learn that he has a son. And what this son represents, I don't know. But it's very much part of that heroic masculinity paradigm. That is, towards the end, that trope is very common in Black writing, especially during the time. That will be a product of his time, I think, will be the birth of this new son. Because you remember in the first novel that I analyzed, Jacques-Stéphane Alexis's novel, the kid dies, the little boy dies. So that represents a lack of hope in Haiti's future. This knowledge of this new son represents the new Cuba. So we have to look at Adida in these terms. This novel is supposed to be a representation of what the new Cuba is supposed to confront and what the revolution has to confront. Because the Batista racism, the racism during the Batista regime did not go away with the revolution. No, it didn't. And that's what a lot of people knew. And that's what this book is bringing up. How do we address all this stuff that's part of our history? Even though the revolution happened, the revolution didn't. How does it attack the injustices before it was installed? And what injustices are happening as a result of the installation of the revolution? That's what this book addresses and comments on. And that's the reason why it probably wasn't talked about as much during the time of its publication. It got an award, it got an honorable mention at the Casa de las Americas contest, which is a prestigious publishing house in Cuba. I mean, the Casa de las Americas version of the Haitian novel that I talked about the last episode 64 was a Casa de las Americas version in Spanish. So there was a recognition of this beautiful novel, complex novel. It's a beautiful novel, though. It really is. Unbelievable writing. Well written, very experimental, very complicated to interpret. And but it was also fun to work with as well. So I would recommend, like I said, any of this stuff, I would recommend my audience take a look into. General Son, My Brother, you can get in English. Jacques-Stéphane Alexis's The Haitian Novel you can get. But this one here, I don't even know you could get an English copy or not. I don't even know if it's been translated into English. I want to say that it has, but to get a copy of that, I don't even have a copy of the English version. And the Spanish version I have is photocopied. I need to get the physical book myself of Adida, and you will see the cover art in the thumbnail of this video description, episode 65. Again, that's all I have for you today. I want to talk about a lot more, but there's time constraints again. I rambled more on this episode. I liked my episode 64, but again, this is real time. I don't have really any notes to go by. I'm just kind of winging this off of my head. But I still think that there's value to it, and I hope you all learned something about the Cuban Revolution that you may not have known about before. And hopefully, I covered all the information I wanted to cover about Julian, the protagonist himself, briefly. Episode 66, we have Amira Napier. Amira is going to describe her experience as a Palestinian American. We're going to talk about Palestine and Israel. Episode 67, we're going to have a Julian Assange panel with Paula Iacella and Julia Hansen. I'm sure that's going to be a wonderful discussion. Paula has an evidence files. She has a compilation put together of all this information about Julian Assange. Unbelievable amount of work that she's put into this. And the following episode will be Gavin Bonnie, independent candidate running for president of the United States. I've already interviewed the third party and independent candidates twice. That will be the case after I interview Mr. Bonnie this upcoming Thursday. Then we have the People's Party of Texas coming up. I believe episode 25, you can go back and watch People's Party of Texas. They do some unbelievable, beautiful work in the communities. Just follow the forum. We have something for everybody. I can't tell you everyone I have coming up in the month of October and November. We have some pretty big names coming up, and we have smaller names. But you know what? All these names matter. And I believe you all are going to get a wealth of knowledge from the guests. And I hope you all enjoy your day, beautiful people. Please subscribe again. Tell everyone you can about this forum. And enjoy your day. Thanks so much for listening to this.